Welcome back to Homicidal Tendency. I'm your host, Matt, and I'm so glad you're joining us today because we've officially hit episode 6. Whether you've been with us since the launch or you're just now jumping into the fray, we're so thrilled to have you as part of our community. But just one thing before we jump into the grit of today's case, I want to make sure we stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, Tumblr, and now Facebook. But Instagram's kind of the hub, so follow for behind-the-scenes content, case photos, and updates on upcoming episodes. Also, if you don't mind, if you're enjoying the show, the absolute best way to support this one-man show is to leave a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast platform of choice. I know it takes a little less than 30 seconds, but it helps other listeners find us and boost the show in the algorithm. Thank you in advance. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's get into today's case. It's August in St. Petersburg, Florida, 1991. The air inside the small house on the corner isn't just hot, it's heavy. It smells of grease paint, old polyester, and something else. Something metallic that hasn't quite settled. The first thing the detectives notice isn't the body, it's the eyes, hundreds of them, from every shelf, every corner, every shadow. The painted porcelain faces of clowns that are staring back. Some are smiling, some are weeping, some are frozen in a mid-century slapstick routine that hasn't been funny for decades. But then they look at the center of the room. There amongst the sequins and oversized shoes lies Robert Gierka. To the world, he was Roberto the Great, a man who spent his life crafting joy out of thin air, but today the grease paint is smeared and the costume is torn. And then the lead investigator stops mid-step. He realizes something is wrong with the room. This wasn't just a struggle, it was a performance. The killer didn't just leave, they stayed. They took Bobby's props, his life work, and they arranged them. They turned the murder into a scene of a macabre gallery, a final mocking tribute to the man whose only crime was living out loud in a world that preferred him behind a mask. In the tight-knit, secretive world of the Florida Carnival circuit, they say the show must go on. But for Roberto the Great, the curtain didn't just fall. It was pulled down by someone who knew exactly where the stage lights were hidden. Now that the stage is set, let's meet Robert. While the Roberto the Great case remains underreported and many specific familial details are kept private by surviving relatives, we could piece together a background for Bobby that informs his character. He was born and raised in the Midwest, more specifically Michigan, in the late 40s. Growing up in a post-World War II Midwest as a sensitive, artistically inclined young man was difficult. For Bobby, the circus wasn't just a fantasy, it was a literal escape hatch. The circus was one of the few places in mid-century America where being different wasn't a professional asset, but a social liability. Like many performers of his generation, Bobby was drawn to Florida. In the 60s and 70s, Florida was the winter home of the circus. He moved south to turn a fascination with performance into a professional career. Bobby just didn't put on a wig. He was a student of classical clowning. This involved learning the agitator versus the august dynamics with physical slapstick and the delicate art of face making. But more on that later. To understand Bobby's time at Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey's Clown College, you have to understand this wasn't a weekend workshop. This is the Harvard of clowning. To get in, you had to audition against thousands of people where there were only about 30 to 50 spots. It was a grueling 8-week boot camp in Venice, Florida that operated with the intensity of a military academy. For Bobby, attending in the late 60s or early 70s meant that he was part of the quote-unquote new wave of American clowns, trained to revitalize an art form that was losing its luster. The college was located at the winter headquarters of the Ringling Circus. Bobby would have lived in dormitories surrounded by elephants, acrobats, and the constant smell of sawdust and popcorn. It was an immersive 27/4 world. The classes ran from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., 6 days a week. Bobby just didn't learn to walk in big shoes. He was trained in acrobatics and tumbles, which was learning how to fall without breaking bones, which is essential for slapstick. He was taught pyrotechnics, which is to handle exploding props safely, animal handling, how to work alongside the massive circus animals, and the design of face. Each student had to design their own unique face which they could like later register as a trademark, and no other clown could use it, which is kind of cool. As a side note, during Bobby's time at the college, he would have been taught by legends like Lou Jacobs and Frosty Little. Lou Jacobs was the clown whose face was on the US postage stamp, and for a young man like Bobby, being critiqued by these masters was the pinnacle of his life. Bobby likely learned the Auguste style here. Auguste meaning it's the German word for stupid or clumsy, and it's where they wear the exaggerated makeup, the white circles around the eyes and mouth, the big nose, and it usually is one of the getting hit in the face with a pie or a bucket, that kind of like slapstick kind of comedy. Now we're coming back around to like the first face ritual. So students weren't allowed to wear makeup for the first several weeks. They had to prove they could be funny without the mask first. When Bobby finally got to apply his grease paint, it's a rite of passage in the circus world. The makeup is seen as like a second skin. The climax of Bobby's time at the college was the walk around, and this was the final performance in front of the Ringling producers. And as a side note, only a tiny percentage of graduates were actually offered a contract to tour with the quote unquote big show, which was Ringling's red or blue units. Whether Bobby toured with the national show or moved straight into shrine circuits, shrine circuses are like a smaller private situation. We'll talk about that more later. His degree from Venice gave him instant carny cred. It meant he was a first of May, which is circus slang for a rookie who survived the winter training. The one thing that Clown College taught Bobby was the mask is the truth. He learned that you can hide your sadness, your fear, and your personal life behind a layer of white and lead zinc paint. Now let's talk about his persona. Roberto the Great represents the tragic gap between a man's public brilliance and his private vulnerability. Bobby just didn't play a character, he crafted a meticulous, high-end persona that belonged to the golden age of circus. Roberto was not like the scary or cheap clowns that we see today. He was modeled after the European Auguste tradition, as we said before. He didn't wear a jumpsuit, he wore a tuxedo of chaos. This usually involved a mismatched, oversized formal coat, a loud checkered vest, and a massive floppy bow tie. It was the look of a man trying to be dignified but failing spectacularly. Like we hinted at before, in the circus, a clown's face is their legal trademark. It's a cardinal sin to copy another clown's face. Bobby's ritual involved a meticulous recreation of his Roberto geometry every single time. He painted a large white muzzle around his mouth and chin. This was to exaggerate his smile and make his lip movements look more visible from the back of a large arena. Instead of a large, terrifying circles, Bobby used high arched eyebrows. He painted thin black lines, surprised lines, high on his forehead, which gave Roberto a look of permanent innocence wonder. He also used vibrant vermilion red for his lower lip and the blush on his cheeks. Unlike the chaotic smudges of an amateur, Bobby's red accents were perfectly symmetrical circles applied with a sponge. He used a professional latex or balloon nose that was custom fitted to the bridge of his nose. He would use spirit gum, which is a surgical grade adhesive, to bond the nose directly to his skin. This meant that the nose moved when he smiled or scrunched his face, making his character feel more real rather than a man in a mask. He also polished the nose to a high gloss shine so it would catch the light of the spotlight. Roberto's face was also framed by a specific color palette that became his brand. He wore a bright synthetic orange-red wig that was styled to bushy tufts on the side, leaving the top of his head quote-unquote bald, which is part of the Auguste trait in style. To finish the look, he often perched a tiny formal bowler hat at a jaunty angle on the top of the wig. The hat was held in place with hidden pins, appearing to defy gravity as he tumbled or bowed. Because Bobby was a student of pantomime, his makeup was designed to move with his face. When he frowned, the white muzzle would wrinkle in a way that looked like it was heartbreaking and sad. When he smiled, the high arched eyebrows would wrinkle and crinkle, making him look like a genuinely mischievous clown. Moreover, the ritual of putting on the face is often done in silence. Professional clowns often describe a moment of applying the makeup, usually When the red nose is finally placed is where the human leaves and the persona takes over. For Bobby, who struggled with social isolation and pressures of being a closeted man in the 90s, this ritual likely was the happiest time. In front of the mirror, he was no longer a lonely man, but he was becoming one of the great ones. Bobby also lived by a set of rules established by the Clowns of America International. This ritual was governed by the following ethics. You never let the public see you half on. You're either Bobby or you're Roberto. To be seen between is breaking the magic. Once the face is on, you represent the entire history of the craft. You do not smoke, you do not drink, and you do not engage in unseemly behavior. We can say the killer turned this code against him by staging the body with his props. The killer forced a half-on, half-off state upon Bobby. They stripped him from his dignity, and they stripped him from his pride. But back to the ritual. The final step of the ritual is, quote-unquote, stepping into the boots. Professional clown shoes are incredibly heavy and require kind of like a slapping gait. When Bobby put on those shoes, his center of gravity shifted. He walked differently. He breathed differently. And even his voice changed. This ritual is a full body possession. Okay, so let's talk about his performances and the style he used. Bobby wasn't a loud clown. He didn't use air horns or aggressive slapstick. Roberto was largely silent or soft-spoken as a character. He relied on micro expressions and the slow take, which is where something goes wrong and he doesn't realize it for 10 seconds or so, allowing the audience to laugh at his impending disaster. He also incorporated baffling magic tricks. He would perform sleight of hand that was intentionally clunky at first, only to end with a genuine, beautiful flourish. This made the children in his audience feel protective of him. They felt like they were helping him succeed. In the Florida circuit, the name Roberto the Great carried heavy weight. He was the prestige choice for high-end events at the St. Petersburg Yacht Club. He was the clown for the children of the elite, which required a level of polish, cleanliness, and wit that the quote-unquote street clowns didn't possess. Probably Roberto's most unique factor was that he used puppets. He didn't just use balloon animals. He had high-quality ventriloquist-style puppets that he interacted with as they were his actual co-workers. Bobby often spoke about the philosophy of Roberto. He believed that a clown's job was to take all the clumsiness and failure of being a human and turn it into something beautiful. Bobby once alluded to the idea, when I'm Roberto, I'm invulnerable. No one can hurt a man that is already a joke. This creates a devastating narrative of irony. He created Roberto to be a shield. He thought that by becoming a great clown, he could escape the small fears of being a gay man in a judgmental society. Bobby didn't just take the traditional path of traveling in a caravan with the Ringling Circus for 20 years. Instead, he carved out a lucrative, high-status niche in the shrine circus and corporate event world. He became a first-call performer in the Egyptian Shriners in Tampa. If you don't know what that is, it's like the old guys in the fez hats with the little tassels. It was a fraternal organization that ran massive circus events. To be a Shriner clown, it meant you had to be part of a brotherhood. You were respected. You were respected, not just the help. So basically, he became part of like the Shriners, which is a big deal. His persona was also so polished that he was hired by major Florida institutions like the Moss Brothers Department Store and, like we said before, the St. Petersburg Yacht Club. He was the classy choice, the clown that parents trusted with their kids. And during his time working these high-end gigs, he began to distance himself from the balloons and clowns face paint clown world and moved in more into the ventriloquism and the puppetry. He invested thousands of dollars in high-end custom-built puppets. They weren't just toys, they were articulated figures with human-like expressions. His house slowly filled with these figures, and as he grew older and perhaps more isolated, his cast of characters grew more and more. Friends noted that he spoke about his puppets as if they were part of his troupe, his silent, supportive family. Now let's talk about Bobby as the man. His life outside the costume is a study in the quiet queer experience of the late 20th century. While Roberto the Great was a man of 1,000 expressions, Bobby was a man of few words, living in a carefully partitioned existence in Florida that was, at the time, both a sun-drenched paradise and a dangerous place for men like him. Outside of the circus, Bobby's primary identity was that of a caregiver. He worked for years at St. Anthony's Hospital in St. Petersburg. He was an orderly and a nursing assistant, both roles that require immense physical and emotional labor. His co-workers knew him as Bobby, the reliable, soft-spoken man who never complained about the night shifts. He was the kind of person who would stay late and hold the hand of a lonely patient. This is also where his two worlds often met. He would use the clowning skills to distract patients during painful procedures using a simple thumb tip or a magic trick or a funny voice to ease their fear. In his personal life, he was the healer. Man, out of the 6 cases I've done so far, this one like gets to me the most. So if I crack up a little bit, that's why. So Bobby eventually bought himself a small white and teal bungalow in St. Pete that would become his first and final sanctuary. Bobby's home at 845 40th Avenue North in St. Petersburg isn't just a setting, it's a secondary character. In true crime storytelling, a victim's home often reflects their internal state, and Bobby's house was a masterpiece of organized obsession. He didn't just have a collection, he lived inside an archive. Every room was dedicated space for circus history. In the living room, instead of family photos, the walls were covered in original large-scale lithograph posters from Heidenbach Wallace and Silas Fulto circuses. Sorry about the pronunciation. These were vibrant, high-value antiques from the early 20th century. Also, friends described floor-to-ceiling cases that were made of glass, filled with figurines of porcelain, glass, and wood clowns. There were hundreds of them, and they were meticulously dusted. Bobby reportedly kept the house somewhat dim to protect the vintage posters from the harsh Florida sun, giving the interior a permanent sense of twilight. Bobby's home was also his studio. One of the rooms served as a hospital for his puppets. It featured a specialized workbench with tiny tools, fine tip brushes, spirit gum, and needles for sewing miniature costumes. There were limbs and heads of puppets in various stages of repair. Sorry, it just made me laugh. To a detective walking in, this room could feel either like a workshop of wonders or a scene of gothic horror from a film, depending on the lighting. Then we get to the most striking or disturbing, depending on your outlook on it. Part of it is that Bobby was never truly alone in the house. In the corner of his rooms, he kept life-sized ventriloquist dummies and mannequins, dressed in his old performance costumes. When investigators entered the crime scene, they were initially startled by these figures, as one would be. In the dark, they looked like people just standing in the corner. For years, Bobby had lived with these silent performers as his only roommates. Despite all the volume of the items in his house wasn't a hoarder's home. It was described as disturbingly clean. Bobby was a bit of a perfectionist. His healthcare background meant that he understood sanitation. Every surface was polished, every costume was steamed, and hung precisely. The extreme orderliness made the crime scene stand out even more. The violence of the struggle and the killer's rearranging of his props shattered the one thing Bobby spent his entire life controlling. From the outside, the teal trim bungalow was the perfect picture of 1990s Florida. The yard was perfectly manicured. Bobby was often seen outside trimming his hedges with hand shears, rarely using loud power tools. Neighbors knew him as the Clown Man, but they almost never saw anyone go inside. The house had a reputation for being a vault. Bobby protected his privacy fiercely, likely to shield the children's entertainer persona from any knowledge of his personal life as a gay man. Almost no one from his civilian life was ever allowed inside. The house was a closet in the literal sense. It contained his queer identity, his circus obsession, and his private vulnerabilities. Now let's talk about Bobby's personal life. His social circles were fascinating. They were a tiered system. It illustrates the compartmentalization that defined his life. He didn't have just one social group, he had three distinct quote unquote families that rarely, if ever, met. The first one was the Sawdust family, the retired circus performers. This was his truest social circle. In Florida, this is the Shadow Circus, a group of retired performers that lived in bungalows and trailer parks between Sarasota and St. Petersburg. His closest friends were the retired ringling performers, people who spoke Canty, which is a circus slang, and understood the physical toll of the life. These are the people that Bobby saw as an artist or as an equal. They would gather to trade stories about the big top or discuss the technicalities of a new puppet design. This group was fiercely protective of one another. Even if they knew Bobby was gay, they wouldn't have spoke about it to townies or outsiders. In the circus, you were judged by your act, not what goes on in your bedroom. Now let's talk about his white coat family or the hospital staff. At St. Anthony's Hospital, Bobby had a completely different social identity. Bobby had several close female friends among the nursing staff. They saw him as a dependable bachelor friend. He was the one they could vent to about doing a double shift. He would attend hospital potlucks or retirement parties, always polite, always bringing a tray of food, but always leaving early. To this circle, Bobby's clowning was a charming hobby, and his personal life was a blank space. They knew he lived alone, and he loved his house. But the Roberto in his closet was a secret he kept close to his chest. Now let's talk about the Midnight Circle, or the gay underground. This was Bobby's most vulnerable social circle, and probably the dangerous. He was a wallflower at the Silver Meteor. Bobby frequented the Silver Meteor and the Detroit Hotel, but he wasn't a social butterfly. He was often described as a man who would sit at the corner of the bar for hours with a single drink, watching the room. In his late 40s, Bobby was looking for companionship in a scene that was becoming increasingly young and fast paced. He didn't fit the muscle bound aesthetic of the 90s gay scene, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. He had a few close friends within the community, other older gay men, which he shared the fear of being outed. He looked they looked out for one another. They checked in via phone calls, which is how his body was eventually discovered after he failed to answer a check-in call. And then lastly, his last social circle, which sounds like something out of a psychological thriller, but detectives and friends alike noted that Bobby's puppets and mannequins were a legitimate part of his social ecosystem. Bobby gave his puppets names, backstories, and distinct voices. He would rehearse with them in his living room, effectively holding conversations with himself. So that leaves the question is, did the puppets replace the human connection he was too afraid to pursue, or were they simply just friends who didn't judge his dual lifestyle? To fully tell the story of Bobby, you have to understand that the gay scene in St. Petersburg and Tampa wasn't just a place to party, it was a high stakes underworld. It was a time of the great contradiction. The community was becoming more visible and political, yet it was being decimated by a plague and hunted by a police force that still viewed the queer man as predator or victims in waiting. In early 1990s, St. Pete was a city of parks, but for gay men, those parks were a battlefield. Places like Mirror Lake or Straub Park were known as beats or places to cruise. Men would often park their cars and they'd walk the trails under the guise of an evening stroll. These spots were also target for gay bashing gangs. Often groups of teenagers would go trolling for gay men to beat or rob, knowing the victims would be too terrified to report it to the police for fearing of being outed or being a headline in the St. Petersburg Times. The police department often ran vice operations. They would use undercover decoys to lure men into soliciting them, and then they would arrest them. For a man like Bobby, whose career depended on his wholesomeness as an image. As a child's entertainer, one of these arrests would have been a professional death sentence for him. And like we hinted at earlier, Bobby had a couple bars that he would frequent. They weren't the neon-soaked mega clubs of today. They were dark, low-ceiling neighborhood bars. You could say like a dive bar. So the first one was the Detroit Hotel. It was located in downtown St. Pete. This was the legendary Gritty Haunt. It was a place of older men and the leather crowd. They felt comfortable there. It was dark, it smelled of cigarettes and cheap beer, and provided a level of anonymity that Bobby required. Another staple of the scene was the Silver Meteor. The Silver Meteor, this bar served as kind of like the community center of the era. It had back rooms or dark corners where men could speak freely without being overheard by the straight world. But most of these bars had a similar vibe. The patrons were always watching the door. Every time it opened, there was a collective breath hold. Was it a friend, a new face, or was it a cop? Also, you cannot tell the Bobby's story without the AIDS crisis. By 1991, the community was in a state of perpetual mourning. Bobby was 45. Most of the men his age had already lost dozens of friends, and the scene was traumatized. Also in Florida, the gay panic was at an all-time high. People were afraid to touch gay objects or go into gay homes. This likely contributed to the underreporting of the crime, and to many in the public, a dead gay man was just a statistic of a dangerous lifestyle. Also, since Bobby worked in the hospital and he saw the reality of this virus every day, his escape and declining was likely a desperate attempt to find joy in a decade defined by death. In the final months of Bobby's life, his meticulous vault-like existence began to crack. For a man who had spent decades guarding his privacy, the decision to look for a roommate was not just the final move, it was a security breach. Investigators and friends looked closely at why a man who lived comfortably for so long suddenly invited a stranger into his quote-unquote museum. So these are some of the theories why he would. While Bobby was a prestige clown, the early 90s recession hit and the entertainment industry was hit the hardest. Corporate gigs at the yacht club were drying up, and his hospital salary as a nursing assistant was very modest. Another theory is that Bobby was 45. In the gay community of 1991, he was considered older. And with the AIDS crisis taking his peers, maybe the silence of his house, filled only with the puppets, had become too deafening to him. That's really sad. I'm sorry. And then the last theory, it goes back to like expensive and the cost of living. And so they're saying maybe his cost of living, keeping the house hot and cold enough to protect his collectibles and to keep his Roberto persona alive, it was too expensive and he needed someone else like to help pay the bills. So basically, they're saying obviously he needed more money or he was lonely. Either way, it's sad. So let's talk about how did he search for a roommate. So at the time, he didn't have internet or the apps. It was early 1991. He had to use physical infrastructure of the time, which left paper trails. He placed ads in the newspaper. These ads were brief, usually mentioning a quiet 2-bedroom, 1-bath home in North St. Pete for a non-smoker. It's believed that he may have also posted flyers or notes around on bulletin boards in places such as the Detroit Hotel or the Silver Meteor. Even though this was a high-risk move, it signaled that, he was a gay man that lived alone and was willing to open up. So that's what makes it like high risk, like to CD characters. But let's imagine the uncanny valley of the whole thing. Potential roommates would experience when they walked into the house for a tour. A prospect would walk in expecting a standard St. Petersburg bungalow, only to be met with the unblinking eyes of hundreds of porcelain clowns and life-size mannequins of Roberto the Great in the corner. Bobby was a perfectionist. He likely rejected many people for being too messy or too loud. This meant that whoever he finally let and he felt comfortable with was likely someone who knew how to mirror his own style or energy. They would have been a chameleon, a predator. Now that we understand his background, let's look at the last few days of his life. The last 48 hours of Bobby's life are a haunting study in a transition from a vibrant performance to total silence. Because Bobby was a man of strict routines, the deviations in his final hours provided the only roadmap we have to his killer. It begins with him doing exactly what he loved. He had a scheduled performance. He performed for a group of children, possibly at a local community center or a private club. Witnesses later recalled that he was in top form. There was no signs of stress or distraction. After the show, he went through his ritual, but in reverse, wiping away the grease paint, packing away the oversized shoes and costumes in their trunk, and driving back to his home. Neighbors saw him arrive home in the late afternoon. He performed his usual homecoming chore, checking the mailbox and adjusting his porch lights. Now's when the timeline gets a little bit fuzzy. It's believed he maybe visited one of his normal haunts, like the Detroit Hotel on Friday night. And investigators suspect that it's when he met his roommates or a guest that was invited back to his home. Since there was no signs of break-in at the house, no smashed glass or Jimmy locked or anything like that, it states that Bobby likely had held the door open for his killer. Scenes within his kitchen suggested that a meal or drinks had been shared. There were 2 glasses that were found. This wasn't a blitz attack from a stranger in the bushes. It was a social evening that potentially had turned wrong. So now we get to Saturday. Saturdays when his routine was shattered. Bobby often worked the gig economy of the 90s. A Saturday without a phone call or a sighting was highly unusual. He usually spent Saturday mornings tending to his yard. Neighbors noted that the yard was untouched and his curtains, which he normally opened, were closed. Um, Several friends and booking agents attempted to call the house. The phone rang and rang. So in 1999, 1991, without cell phones, a missed call to a landline was going to be the first red flag that anyone noticed. So now we'll rewind it a couple hours. Forensic evidence suggests that the struggle likely occurred during the late hours of Friday or potentially early hours of Saturday. The house was a closed system. The thick stucco walls and the hum of the AC unit muffled any sounds of the struggle from the street, so basically no one heard anything. The murder of Bobby was notably violent and personal, contrasting sharply with the meticulous, playful order of his home. This detail is crucial because it suggests the killer either harbored deep resentment towards Bobby's identity or was a predator who enjoyed the overkill of a defenseless victim. All right, so I'm sorry if my flat voice gets even more flat. This next part it's depressing. Bobby was killed through a combination of blunt force trauma and strangulation. Forensics suggests Bobby was initially struck or blitzed, possibly while his back was turned or while he was sitting. There were defense wounds on his hands and arms. This tells us that Bobby fought back. In the quiet of that stuccoed bungalow, there was a desperate struggle between a 45-year-old man who lived for the laughter and a killer who brought a terrifying level of physical force. The killer eventually overpowered him, using a ligature, a cord, or an item of clothing to finish the act. The method of killing is intimate. It requires the killer to be in close physical proximity to the victim for several minutes while watching their life leave them. And many gay panic or hate-motivated murders of the era, the violence doesn't stop once the victim dies. Bobby's body showed signs of post-mortem trauma. This indicates a frenzied state in the killer, a release of pent-up rage that went beyond the necessity of robbery. Bobby was a man who spent his life healing people as a nurse and entertaining them as a clown. He was treated with a level of brutality that suggests his killer viewed him as something less than human. The police did not find the murder weapon brought from outside, likely a gun or a specific, anyways, my brain's getting foggy. The police did not find the murder weapon brought from the outside. The killer used what was available in the house. This supports a theory that the meeting started socially. It was a crime of opportunity that escalated into homicide. Because the murder involved such close physical contact, the killer left behind significant evidence that would be vital today. But in 1991, DNA testing was in its infancy and was just not able to be used in court. Police collected samples from the scene, including skin cells from underneath Bobby's fingernails. The blood evidence was concentrated in the museum room. The killer had stepped over or around the blood to perform the staging of the clown props around his body, meaning they likely had Bobby's blood on their shoes or clothes as they did their rearranging. Like we said, the killer didn't just flee. They spent time in Bobby's museum. They looked through the closets, they touched his puppets, and moved the porcelain clowns. The killer likely exited through the back door under the cover of darkness on this Saturday night, taking specific souvenirs of high-value circus collectibles that could be easily pawned. Later, a neighbor reported seeing a dark-colored sedan parked in Bobby's driveway late Friday night, a car that did not belong to him. So, for the St. Petersburg police, walking into the home was like stepping onto a stage where the play had gone terribly wrong. The discovery was triggered by the gay check-in system of the early 90s. This was because of the high rates of violence and isolation of many queer men. Friends often had a 3-ring rule or a daily call time. A close friend, often identified in the archives as a fellow performer or a member of the local community, had been calling Bobby since Saturday morning. By Sunday afternoon, the lack of an answer was no longer just Bobby's busy, it was a crisis. The friend drove to his bungalow and found Bobby's car in the driveway, but the house was still tightly sealed, no open curtains, and when the police arrived, they noticed that the exterior was undisturbed. After getting no response to heavy knocking, officers forced entry through the door. The officers were immediately hit by 2 things: the stagnant human heat that the house was holding. Likely the thermostat was knocked off or turned off by the killer, and the heavy scent of grease paint mixed with decay. This is the most famous and disturbing aspect of the discovery. Police did not find a random crime scene, but they found a curated one. The killer had taken the life-size mannequins and the smaller porcelain clowns from the shelves and arranged them around him. Instead of facing the room, they were all turned to face Bobby's body. And a final cruel touch, the killer had draped Bobby with some of his own performance silks. His Roberto props were scattered around him like a morbid confetti. As detectives began to process the scene, they realized the motive was a strange hybrid, a hybrid of personal rage and calculated theft. Bobby's wallet was gone, along with some performance cash, which would have been the money he made from the Friday gig. Most baffling, several specific pieces of high-value circus memorabilia were missing, items that only someone from the scene would know, a carny, from the carny world. They suggest the killer wasn't just a random drifter, but someone who understands exactly what Bobby cherished. In contrast, the rest of the house remained disturbingly clean. There was no evidence of ransacking, no drawers were overturned, no furniture was smashed in a search for hidden money. This led investigators to believe that the killer had spent a significant amount of time in the house after the murder, calmly picking out what they wanted and arranging Bobby and the scene for the police to find. The investigation into the murder is a study in 1990s forensic frustration. It was a case where the police had an abundance of physical evidence, but a complete lack of context. Because Bobby lived in a compartmentalized life, the detectives were forced to negotiate the 3 different subcultures: the medical world, the carnival world, and the gay underground. None of these of which were particularly eager to talk to the cops. The most significant piece of evidence found during the Sunday discovery was a single latent fingerprint on a porcelain clown figurine. The figurine was one of the items the killer had moved to stage the body. Since Bobby was a meticulous duster, investigators were confident that the print had belonged to the killer. But in 1991, APHIS, the automated database used by police, was not an instantaneous tool as it is today. The print did not match any local criminals or any known circus performers in the Florida database. For 35 years, the print has sat in a file waiting for a name to be attached to it. Police also issued an immediate bulletin to every pawn shop from the Tampa to Sarasota area. They were looking for the stolen route books and the high-end puppets that were also taken. Also, when detectives interviewed the Sawdust family, which are the retired circus performers, they hit a wall. While the circus community loved Bobby, they had a deep-seated us versus them mentality when it came to the police. They were willing to help one of their own, but they refused to speculate on Bobby's personal lives or habits or his gay social life. So basically, they wanted to help find his killer, but they weren't going to confirm or deny, if he was homosexual or whatever. Detectives also realized that their suspect could be in different states every week. Without a name tracking a drifter through the 1990s in the carnival circuit, it was nearly impossible to find them. The police were also forced to look at the cruising angle, but they looked at it with a lens of prejudice. Investigators spent nights at the Detroit Hotel and the Silver Meteor, showing Bobby's photo to bartenders and patrons. They were looking for a specific type of hustler or drifter who could have targeted older men. With that said, early police notes hinted at a quote-unquote risky lifestyle that Bobby had led, which often slowed the momentum of the case. They viewed the murder as an unfortunate byproduct of the cruising scene rather than a target hit by a professional predator. Also, men who may have seen Bobby at the bars that Friday night before his murder, they refused to come forward. To be a witness in a quote-unquote homosexual murder meant being outed on the newspaper. It could lead to losing jobs, losing families. The investigation lost dozens of potential leads due to its closeness to the Lavender Scare. But then we get to the most frustrating lead, which was the roommate search. Police found Bobby's handwritten drafts for the ads that he placed. They found his phone logs showing several incoming calls from payphones in the 48 hours before his death. Bobby usually kept a meticulous notebook of his bookings and appointments. However, that notebook was missing from the scene. Detectives believe the killer took it because it contained their name or a description of the meeting they had with Bobby. So now we get to the even more frustrating part. By 1992, the investigation had flatlined for three reasons. There was no cell phone towers, so there's no way to ping cell phones. There's no GPS, and there was no credit card details or trails. So there's no way to find out what was going on with the killer. At the time, profiling was also at its infancy. Police saw the clown props as a sign of a crazy person rather than a specific psychological signature that could have helped narrow down the suspect's relationship to Bobby. And then paradoxically, there was too much DNA at Bobby's house. Bobby's house was a high traffic museum. Sorting the killer's DNA from the hundreds of performers who had visited over the years was a lab's nightmare that the 1991 technology just could not handle. The profile of the killer is just as surreal as the crime scene itself. Because the killer had stayed behind to stage the body with the props, we have a window into their psyche that most cold cases lack. Most modern FBI behavioral profiling suggests that this X factor of the clown props tells us exactly who the killer was. When a killer rearranges a scene or covers a body, it's often a sign of remorse or a personal connection. By surrounding Bobby with his clowns, the killer may have been trying to restore Bobby to his persona or effectively undoing the murder. Conversely, if the staging felt mocking, it suggests the killer who felt humiliated by Bobby or the queer community. This points to a gay panic perpetrator, someone who engaged in a sexual act and then felt quote unquote tainted and killed Bobby. And to destroy the evidence of his own identity, he then mocked Bobby with the clowning as a childish or freakish act. Okay, so that brings us to the suspect categories. Category A is a young man in his early 20s, likely a drifter that Bobby met at a bar or through his ad. This person's MO would have been to leech off of Bobby, be someone who targets a lonely older man, moves in, and slowly drains their resources before turning violent. And then we get to category B, which is a disgruntled carny. The motive behind this one is resentment of Bobby's high-class clown act, since he worked at the yacht clubs and the Shriners. To any struggling carny, this work would kind of mock them or feel like they're less because they weren't like the high-class clown or whatever. They worked in the regular carnivals and the dirty, that kind of situation, which leads to the theft. They would have known which memorabilia had the most value and what to take and like what to leave behind. And then the C category is the rough trade predator. This would have been someone that had like the tough guy persona, who frequented gay bars to lure these older gay guys home. And then once they got to his home, maybe the sight of the clowns and the puppets may have triggered some kind of like violent homophobic reaction or a freak out murder. This suspect would likely have a criminal record or a record of robbery or assault with deadly weapon or battery or something like that. So those are the three like quote unquote categories of suspects. Obviously, nothing has ever came of it because it's it's still a cold case. So we'll talk about the cold case situation next. This cold case is an example of a solvable mystery that has slipped through the cracks of time and technology and social stigma. Today, the file sits in the St. Pete's Police Department cold case unit in a thick binder that has color-coded leads that have all turned gray. Since 1991, there has been zero movement on the case. No one has ever been arrested, and there's never been a primary suspect. The fingerprint on the staged porcelain clown is still the strongest piece of evidence. In the 90s, the police hoped the killer would get arrested for something else and trigger a match in APHIS, but it never happened. While the police have DNA from the struggle, it remains a silent profile like the fingerprint that has no faces to match to it. One of the reasons the case went so cold so quickly was the era in which it occurred. In the early 90s, homosexual homicides, as they were often referred to and labeled in police files, were frequently treated with less urgency. There was a prevailing sense of it's an at-your-own-risk attitude towards gay men who cruise or sought out roommates in the underground scene. Because of the Lavender Scare, many people who might have seen Bobby with a stranger at the Detroit Hotel or the Silver Meteor or a local park kept their secrets to the grave rather than risking their reputation. Oh my gosh. Anyways, risking their reputation by talking to the police. Furthermore, also, the items that were stolen from Bobby have never surfaced. The circus route books, which were the most significant loss and the most rare loss, the detailed logs kept by the circuses, like Ringling Brothers, that tracked every stop, every mile traveled, every event, every special occasion that were part of Bobby's collection. They also included editions from the 1920s and 1930s. Also amongst the things stolen were his professional ventriloquist puppets, Several high-end custom-made puppets were taken. Unlike the toy dolls, they were professionally made figurines with complex internal mechanics for the eyes and the mouth movements. Also taken were vintage circus posters, rare lithographs from the golden age of the American circus, and they were stripped from his walls. The most practical thing taken was the 1983 maroon Oldsmobile Omega. The killer used Bobby's own car to flee the scene. It was later found abandoned in Tampa, suggesting the killer used it to cross the Gandy or the Howard Franklin Parkland Bridge to disappear in the city or on to I-75. This also goes on to prove that a random thief would have taken the TV or the VCR or the easy-to-pawn jewelry. The thief chose items that are difficult to sell unless you know a specific collector. To recognize the value of a 1920s route book, you have to be part of the Sawdust subculture, the carnies, basically. This led police to investigate the carnies and the traveling performers. Interestingly, the porcelain clowns, which were used to watch Bobby's body, were not taken. This implies the killer viewed these specific items as part of the message or the tableau of the murder, or rather than a loot. But moving on. The police, they still have the DNA from 1991. They could upload them to public databases. Even if the killer is dead or was never arrested, they could find a second cousin or a nephew, anyone, to build a family tree that could lead back to Bobby's house, to his murderer. This case is not unsolvable. In the decades since Bobby was taken from us, the world has changed. Technology has caught up to the shadows. But we need your help to turn the lights back on. To the collectors out there, the collectors of circus memorabilia, have you come across these vintage books or professional puppets with a questionable or found history dating back to the early 90s? Look closer. These items might be part of the smoking gun of Bobby's murder. If you lived in St. Pete or the North Quarter in 1991 and remember a young man, maybe a drifter, or a new roommate who suddenly vanished from 40th Avenue area in August, your memory matters. Also, we're calling on the St. Pete Police Department to revisit the biological evidence on file. Use modern investigative genetic genealogy. Trace the DNA. Find out who was there. Find a name. Find the killer. Also, you, the listeners of this small independent podcast, if you have any information, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please contact the St. Pete Police Cold Case Unit at 727-893-719. You can remain anonymous. All right, let's close this out. Bobby spent his life making sure the show went on. Now it's our job to make sure the truth comes out. After the police tape came down, the world moved on. The hospital hired a new orderly. The Shrine Circus found a new clown. But for the people who knew Bobby, the world felt a little bit colder. We like to think that justice is a clock, that it's always ticking towards an answer. But in Bobby's case, the clock stopped in August 1991. His puppets were boxed up and sold. His grease paint was thrown away. Today, Roberto the Great is a legend whispered in the Florida dive bars and circus trailers. He's the man who lived two lives, the clown who died alone. But until that fingerprint finds a name, Bobby isn't a person anymore. He's just a cautionary tale. All right, kids. That concludes the tale of Roberto the Great. And like I said, this one, it touched me on a completely different level. 6 cases in, but this guy, he just wanted to live his life, and he was taken from us way too soon for who knows the reason. It doesn't matter. And we'll leave it there. Thank you for joining me in the dark. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with your friends and leave a 5-star review. It helps more than you know with the algorithm. And follow the show at Homicidal Tendency on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Tumblr. Yes, even Tumblr, for photos and media from today's case. We'll be back next week with a new case. Until then, remember, spill the tea, not the blood.